West of Sunset. Just a few comments before we'll hear from the first chapter. West of Sunset was first published in January 2015 by Viking Penguin in New York, and the novel is set in the late 1930s. It traces the last 3 years of Scott Fitzgerald's life, which he spent mostly in New York. So when we think about Scott Fitzgerald, we usually think of this highly recognized literary figure of the 20th century, who is best known for his novel The Great Gatsby, published in 1925, and I'm sure all of you are familiar with it, either with the text itself or with one of the filmic adaptations. The time period covered in Stewart's novel, which is 1937 to 1940, is one which is more often than not neglected, or at least marginalized in popular discourse on Scott Fitzgerald. The period is marked by the decline of popularity and success of the author and his work. Scott Fitzgerald at the time was in great debt and struggling to make ends meet, and adding to these professional struggles were also concerns in his private life, with his wife Zelda being hospitalized in 1930, I think. And from then on spent most time in hospitals and sanatoriums. And Scott himself was a heavy drinker at the time, in his early 40s, and his health too was declining. And when he realized finally that he could no longer provide for himself, let alone for his wife and his daughter Scotty, he decided that it was about time to start a new chapter in his life and in his career, and left for LA to work as a screenwriter at Hollywood. And I think this is a good starting point for the first reading from the first chapter of West of Sunset.
Thank you. Two epigraphs for the book. The first is from the notes to The Last Tycoon, his unfinished novel. There are no second acts in American lives. And the other is from a short story about Hollywood, Crazy Sundays. Nothing was impossible. Everything was just beginning. Chimney Rock. That spring he holed up in the Smokies, in a tired resort hotel by the asylum, so he could be closer to her. A bout of pneumonia over Christmas had provoked a flare-up of his TB, and he was still recovering. The mountain air was supposed to help. Days he wrote in his bathrobe, drinking Coca-Cola to keep himself going, holding off on the gin till nightfall, a small point of pride, sipping on the dark veranda as couples strolled among the fireflies rising from the golf course. Outside of town, Highland Hospital crowned the ridgeline, a spired Gothic palace in the clouds, worthy of a bewitched princess. He couldn't afford it, as he couldn't afford the other private clinics they had tried, but he pleaded poverty and hashed out a discount with the trustees, begging the money from his agent, an onerous form of credit, borrowing against stories he'd yet to imagine.
Can you tell us why you chose to write about F. Scott Fitzgerald? Is there any personal connection between you and the author, or between you and his work?
No more than any other American, I think. I mean, as an American writer, he's such a great part of the tradition. You know, this great lyrical voice, a great comic writer. In America, he's usually seen as a tragic writer because of Gatsby or Tender as the Night, but he's one of the great, great comic writers. There's a very light irony that runs throughout his sentences. And a gorgeous sense of metaphor, figurative language. So he's always been sort of on my mind as a fellow writer. He's also great at compression. When you think of the great American novel, it's not a big 800-page book like Jonathan Franzen. It's The Great Gatsby, 215 pages. Or Catcher in the Rye, 185 pages. We're not this big elephantine type of culture. It's much slimmer.
Appreciate it.
Thank you. But other than that, there was no great connection between us at the time. But I'd known that Fitzgerald had been out in Hollywood at the end of his life. And those moments are usually skimped over by biographers. They're usually seen as a bad time in his life, a waste of his time, actually. When he should have been writing great fiction, there he was writing screenplays, and not being appreciated. That's the way that it's seen mostly. I was interested in the Fitzgerald that had everything and lost it, and then had to recreate himself and become this other thing. In 1935, he's broke, he's not writing, in what he is writing, he's writing poorly. He doesn't believe in himself, he's lost that faith in his power as an artist. And he goes out to Hollywood, and my view of it, in reading his letters and his journals and reading the fiction that he wrote out there, is that he refound himself. That he reclaimed that romantic view of life that was so important to him. And began this novel, The Last Tycoon, which I think is what exists of it, which is about 150 pages, is as good a Hollywood novel as there is. And it's widely seen as maybe the best Hollywood novel ever written, even though it's a fragment there. Nathaniel West's The Day of the Locust is also a great, great novel. In fact, when West finished it, he brought it to Fitzgerald, because Fitzgerald was a great friend of his, and said, "Scott, tell me, is this any good?" And Fitzgerald said, "It's brilliant, it's marvelous." And so he gave it a quote. So I think he found himself there. That's the Fitzgerald that I'm interested in. How do you lose everything and continue on? And that's a theme that I go back to again and again in my books. In The Good Wife, Patty, her husband goes to prison for 25 years for life for murder. How does she carry on after that sentence? There. Manning in Last Night at the Lobster, he's losing his job, his position, the restaurant that he works with. He's losing his girlfriend, his grandmother has died. He has nothing. How does he endure? How does he go on? So that's the Fitzgerald that I was interested in. I don't know if that Fitzgerald exists outside of my view of him. Certainly in American Letters, people don't see him that way. So that seemed to be the difficulty, the impossibility of this narrative, is how do I bring this Scott Fitzgerald, this new Scott Fitzgerald, to light for American readers who are so in love with the Fitzgerald of Gatsby, or the Fitzgerald of being an alcoholic, or the ruined Fitzgerald. This is a living Fitzgerald who still has hope and ambition and skill, and he brings that skill to bear, and it's the only thing he has left, his belief in his talent. He gets that back, and he works himself to death, I think, which is also a very American thing, certainly in Hollywood. But that's really what I was interested in. How do you go on after you've lost everything, right? Samuel Beckett, right? I can't go on, I'll go on. That's what we do.
Your research, the research you had to do before writing the novel. Can you tell us something about this?
Well, the first bit of research that I had to do was to reread all of Fitzgerald and all of Zelda's writings as well, which is a great, great pleasure to sort of get that sensibility and at least look at the vocabulary that they use. I knew that I was going to write the book in the third person, or the he voice, or the they voice, rather than the first person, because you can't out-Fitzgerald Fitzgerald. But I did want to look at that sensibility and say, what does he look at? What's important to him? What relationships between people does he find fascinating? So I went back to that, not just the fiction, but also all the nonfiction pieces that they wrote for magazines back in the 20s when they were very happy and very happily married at that point. And then looking at all of their correspondence throughout their lives. And there was such a great industry of Fitzgerald posthumous writings that you can find thousands and thousands of letters that both he and Zelda wrote. So that was the most important research that I had to do. All of the Hollywood stuff could come later, could be fit in as I needed it. You know, like being on the lot there at MGM, knowing who was at the Garden of Allah, where he later moved, which was very, very famous, and still is a very famous sort of epoch in American life. Dorothy Parker is there, Humphrey Bogart is there, Robert Benchley, S.J. Perelman, who wrote the Marx Brothers movies. So there's all this celebrity and all this great success there. And into this walks Scott Fitzgerald, who is drunk and broke, and everybody knows it. But they still respect him there. And before this, he's living by himself, first in North Carolina, and then when he moves to Hollywood, the studio puts him up in this place out in Santa Monica called the Miramar, where he's living all by himself, which is the most dangerous thing for someone who is both depressed and alcoholic. And He finds his way to the Garden of Valley because Dorothy Parker invites him to several parties. She had an affair with him back in New York, back in the 20s, and is still a great friend and admirer of him, even if he is drunk and broke, because she has experienced being drunk and broke herself. But she still has great respect for his talent. And so finally he's back where he needs to be, there, among friends, after sort of wandering alone for, I want to say 4 or 5 years there, which was very, very dangerous for him.
All right.
Well, that means that for a lot of fiction, it's a story about someone who loses everything. So I'm wondering, when you decided to begin this project, how long it took the research? Was there a relationship to the financial crash of 2008? Or with none, maybe? So how long were you working on it? And second, after reading all this work by Fitzgerald, were you consciously influenced by his writing style as you were writing? Or did you look back later and realize maybe you had been unconsciously influenced?
Oh, the first was, is it somehow related to the crash of 2008 in the US, and that idea of someone who has lost everything and having to come back from it? No, no, definitely not. That may spring from where I come from, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where we had everything for many, many years in the steel industry, and then it went away back in the 70s. So I think it goes deeper in me, having grown up in the 60s and 70s, and having sort of witnessed half of the town leaving, and us losing kind of everything there. The second was I consciously influenced by Fitzgerald's style. Yes, of course, how couldn't I be? Yes, most definitely. And when I'm looking at my main character, I want to say, what kind of diction does my main character have, just in terms of what he talks like? And so reading his work and reading his letters let me look at his diction in a closer way than I would almost any other character, because I didn't have to come up with it all on my own. The question is, how do I then manage it or edit it so it doesn't take over? And that is the danger, of course, when you're writing about somebody who is so famous, and has such a famous voice. I knew that I couldn't write his voice, I'd have to maintain my own voice. And that's why I went with third person, so that I always have this authorial figure looking at Scott from the outside and providing an extra level of maybe not irony, but at least separation there. And I think the voice in this book is probably influenced more by people like James Salter and maybe Alice Munro a little bit more.